The morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been the Miller family's farmhouse in the small German village of Bernsdorf, where laughter and the smell of fresh bread had filled the air just days before. Now only silence and the acrid scent of smoke remained. The Allied bombing raid had been swift and merciless, leaving behind a landscape of twisted metal, blackened timber, and broken dreams. Among the debris, a movement caught the eye of anyone who might have been watching. A small German shepherd puppy, no more than 3 months old, picked his way carefully through the rubble. His coat, once a rich golden brown with black markings, was now dulled with ash and soot. His bright brown eyes, however, remained alert and hopeful, scanning the destruction with the innocent determination that only a young animal possesses. The puppy's name was Fritz, though he had no way of telling anyone who might ask. He had been born in the warm barn behind the farmhouse, the last of a litter of 5. His mother, Greta, had been the pride of Johann Miller, a gentle giant of a dog who could herd sheep with precision and protect the family with unwavering loyalty. Fritz had spent his short life tumbling with his siblings in the hay, chasing chickens around the yard, and sleeping curled against his mother's warm belly. But that world had ended 3 days ago when the planes came. Fritz remembered the terrible noise that had filled the sky, louder than any thunderstorm he had ever experienced. He remembered his mother pushing him and his brothers and sisters into the deepest corner of the barn, her body shielding them as the earth shook and buildings exploded around them. He remembered the heat and the bright orange light that had turned night into a hellish day. When morning came and the planes were gone, Fritz had awakened to find himself alone. The barn had partially collapsed, trapping him under a fallen beam. It had taken him hours to dig his way out, his tiny paws bleeding from scraping against the rough wood and stone. When he finally emerged, covered in dirt and debris, he found a world transformed. The farmhouse was gone, reduced to a pile of smoking rubble. The other buildings on the property had suffered similar fates. Worst of all, there was no sign of his family, neither his canine family nor the humans who had cared for them. Fritz called out with his puppy bark, a sound that seemed impossibly small in the vast emptiness that surrounded him. For the first day, he had waited where the kitchen door used to be, convinced that Johann Müller would come walking out at any moment, with his heavy boots and gentle hands that always carried treats. Fritz knew the routine by heart. Every morning, Johann would emerge from the house, call for Greta, and together they would tend to the animals. Fritz and his siblings would tumble out of the barn, eager to join the daily activities, but Johann never came. On the second day, hunger began to gnaw at Fritz's small stomach. He had never needed to find food for himself before. His mother had always been there to nurse him, and recently Johann had begun supplementing their diet with small bowls of warm milk and soft bread. Fritz wandered through the ruins, his nose working overtime to detect any scent that might lead him to something edible. He found scraps here and there, a piece of bread crust that had somehow survived the flames, a few scattered kernels of corn from what had been the chicken coop. But these small discoveries only highlighted how little he understood about survival. Every sound made him jump. The settling of debris, the distant barking of other dogs, the rumble of military vehicles on the road that passed near the farm. By the third day, Fritz had established a pattern that would define his existence for the weeks to come. He would spend the early morning hours searching for food, investigating every corner of the property where something edible might be hidden. He had learned to overturn pieces of debris with his nose, to dig in spots where he caught interesting scents, and to be grateful for even the smallest morsel. But as the day progressed and his immediate needs were addressed, Fritz would return to his vigil. He had chosen a spot near what had been the front steps of the farmhouse, a position that gave him a clear view of the road and the path that led up to the property. There he would sit, his small body perfectly still, his ears perked forward and his eyes fixed on the distance. He was waiting, though he couldn't have explained what he was waiting for in any language humans would understand. Deep in his puppy heart, Fritz held on to the belief that this was all temporary. The destruction around him was like a bad storm that would eventually pass. His mother would return from wherever she had gone. Johann would come walking up the path with his familiar whistle. His siblings would come tumbling out from whatever hiding place they had found. Other dogs had passed by the property during these 3 days. Some were strays who had lost their homes in the same bombing raid. Others were companion animals separated from their families in the chaos that followed the attack. A few had approached Fritz, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in his small, lost form. But Fritz had shown no interest in joining them or following them to whatever uncertain fate awaited displaced animals in wartime. Germany. He had food to find and a watch to keep. The local villagers who occasionally passed on the road had noticed him too. Frau Richter, whose own house had been damaged but not destroyed, had stopped twice to look at the small figure keeping his lonely vigil. She had even approached once, speaking in the soft, coaxing voice people use with frightened animals. But Fritz had retreated into the ruins, not out of fear of this kind woman, but because accepting help felt like giving up on his weight. As the sun began to set on his third day alone, Fritz settled into his chosen spot once more. The September evening was growing cool, and he could feel the chill beginning to penetrate his thin puppy coat. Soon he would need to find shelter for the night, probably in the partially collapsed barn where he had spent the previous 2 nights. But not yet. There were still a few hours of daylight left. Still time for someone to appear on that road and recognize him. Still time for his world to be put back together. Fritz had no way of knowing that his wait would stretch on for weeks, that his story was just beginning, or that his unwavering loyalty would soon touch the hearts of people he had never met. All he knew was that this was where he belonged, and this was where he would stay until his family came home. 2 weeks had passed since Fritz began his vigil among the ruins, and the small German shepherd had developed the survival instincts that would keep him alive through the harsh months ahead. His ribs had become more visible beneath his increasingly matted coat, but his eyes remained as alert and hopeful as ever. Every morning brought the same routine: search for food, drink from the small stream that ran behind the property, and then return to his watching post. The weather had begun to turn colder, and Fritz had learned to seek shelter in the partially collapsed barn during the worst of the rain and wind. He had discovered that by digging a small depression in the hay that remained scattered across the barn floor, he could create a nest that retained his body heat through the night. But even during the worst storms, he would venture out periodically to check the road, unwilling to miss the moment when his family might return. His daily food searches had become more systematic and successful. Fritz had learned that the best scraps were often found near what had been the kitchen area of the farmhouse, where pieces of preserved food had been scattered and buried under debris. He had also discovered that the neighboring farms sometimes discarded vegetable peelings and other organic waste that, while not ideal, could sustain a growing puppy. More importantly, Fritz had begun to attract the attention of the local community in ways that would change his life forever. Frau Richter had been the first to take more than a passing interest in the small dog's plight. As one of the few villagers whose house had survived the bombing with only minor damage, she had become something of a coordinator for relief efforts in Bernsdorf. Every few days she would walk through the village assessing needs and checking on those who had been displaced or injured. During her third encounter with Fritz, she had decided to test his willingness to accept help. Instead of approaching him directly, she had simply left a small bowl of milk and some bread scraps near the ruins and continued on her way. When she returned the next day, the bowl was empty, and Fritz was back in his usual position watching the road. This had begun a careful dance between the woman and the dog that would continue for weeks. Frau Richter would leave food. Fritz would consume it gratefully but would never abandon his post for long enough to properly interact with his benefactor. She began to time her visits to observe him from a distance, fascinated by his unwavering dedication to his vigil. Word of the loyal puppy began to spread through the village. In a time when everyone was dealing with their own losses and hardships, Fritz's story provided something that the community desperately needed: a reminder that loyalty, hope, and love could survive even the worst disasters. Herr Zimmermann, the village postman who had somehow managed to continue his rounds despite the destruction, had started timing his route to pass the Muller property when Fritz would be visible. He would always slow his bicycle and nod respectfully to the small dog, as if acknowledging a fellow worker who took his duties seriously. The local children, many of whom had been evacuated to relatives in other towns immediately after the bombing, began to return to Bernsdorf as their families attempted to rebuild. When they learned about Fritz from their parents, several of them asked permission to visit him. Their parents, understanding that the children needed something positive to focus on, agreed to supervised visits. 8-year-old Klaus Weber was the first child to successfully approach Fritz. Unlike the adults who had tried to coax him away from his post, Klaus simply sat down in the rubble about 10 feet away from the puppy and began talking to him in the matter-of-fact way that children have with animals. "My house got bombed too," Klaus told Fritz during their first meeting. "But my family is alive. We're staying with my aunt now, but my papa says we'll rebuild our house even better than before. I bet your family will come back too. Dogs are good at finding their way home." Fritz had listened to this young voice with an attention he hadn't shown to any human since the bombing. Something about Klaus's presence was non-threatening and comforting. The boy didn't try to pick him up or force him to leave his post. He simply shared his own story and seemed to understand Fritz's need to wait. Over the following days, Klaus returned several times, always with his mother's permission and usually carrying something for Fritz, a bit of sausage saved from his own meal or a small bowl of water. During these visits, Klaus would update Fritz on the village rebuilding efforts, tell him about his school lessons, or simply sit quietly and keep him company. These visits had a profound effect on Fritz's daily routine. While he never abandoned his watch completely, he began to look forward to Klaus's arrival. The boy's presence seemed to make the waiting less lonely and more purposeful. Klaus treated Fritz's vigil as something important and admirable, never suggesting that the puppy should give up or move on. Other children began to follow Klaus's example. Soon, Fritz had a small group of regular visitors who would stop by individually or in pairs to check on him and share bits of food or simply their company. The children named themselves Fritz's friends and took pride in their role as his protectors and supporters. Their parents, initially worried about their children becoming too attached to what might ultimately be a lost cause, began to see the positive impact these visits were having. In a world that had become unpredictable and frightening, caring for Fritz gave the children a sense of purpose and taught them about loyalty and compassion. The story of Fritz's vigil had also reached the ears of Father Brennan, the elderly priest who served several villages in the area. Father Brennan had seen many heartbreaking situations during his decades of service, but something about this small dog's unwavering faith resonated deeply with his own beliefs about loyalty and hope. One crisp October morning, Father Brennan made his way carefully through the ruins to where Fritz maintained his watch. The old priest settled his aging bones onto a piece of debris and spent nearly an hour in quiet contemplation, while Fritz sat alert nearby. "You know, my friend," Father Brennan finally said aloud, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to speaking to those who needed comfort. "There are many kinds of faith in this world. Some people struggle to maintain their faith even when surrounded by comfort and safety. But you found something much rarer, the ability to hope and wait even when everything around you has been destroyed." Fritz turned his head toward the priest's voice, and for a moment their eyes met. Father Brennan was struck by the intelligence and determination he saw in the puppy's gaze. "I think," the priest continued, "that you're teaching all of us something important about what it means to truly believe in something. Whether your family returns or not, you're showing us that love doesn't end when everything else falls apart." As autumn deepened and the first frost began to appear on the debris around the Mueller farm, Fritz had unknowingly become the spiritual center of Bernsdorf's recovery efforts. People would mention him in conversations, use his dedication as an example when encouraging each other to persevere, and find comfort in the idea that somewhere in their broken village, pure loyalty still existed. But Fritz remained focused on his singular purpose, watching the road and waiting for the family that had loved him before the world changed forever. By November, Fritz had been waiting for 6 weeks, and his story had begun to reach beyond the borders of Bernsdorf. A newspaper reporter from the regional paper in Dresden had heard about the loyal puppy from a relative who lived in the village. War stories were common in 1943, but stories of hope and devotion were precious commodities that editors knew their readers desperately needed. The reporter, Hans Müller, no relation to Fritz's missing family, arrived on a gray November morning with a notebook and a determination to capture something uplifting amid the endless reports of destruction and loss. What he found exceeded his expectations. Fritz had grown considerably in the weeks since the bombing, though he remained thin despite the regular offerings from his network of supporters in the village. His coat had thickened in preparation for winter, and his legs had lengthened, giving hints of the impressive dog he would become if he survived the coming months. But his routine remained unchanged, constant vigilance interrupted only by necessary trips for food and water. Hans spent 3 hours observing Fritz before attempting any interaction. He watched as Klaus Weber arrived for his daily visit, settling beside the puppy with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. He observed as Frau Richter made her rounds, leaving food and checking that Fritz seemed healthy. He noted how other villagers would nod respectfully toward Fritz as they passed, as if acknowledging a fellow survivor who was doing his part to hold the community together. When Hans finally approached, he was struck by Fritz's response. Unlike his reaction to most strangers, Fritz didn't retreat. Instead, he seemed to study the newcomer with an intelligence that suggested he understood this person was different from his usual visitors. "You're quite famous." "You know," Hans told Fritz, settling carefully onto a piece of concrete debris. "People are starting to talk about you in other towns. They're calling you the most loyal dog in Germany." Fritz tilted his head at the sound of the stranger's voice, and Hans was moved by the alertness and hope that never seemed to fade. From the puppy's expression, the article that appeared in the Dresden paper the following week was titled, "Faith on Four Legs, the Puppy Who Won't Give Up." It told Fritz's story with a combination of factual reporting and emotional resonance that captured readers' imagination across the region. The article described not just Fritz's vigil, but the way his presence had affected the entire community of Bernsdorf. Hans had interviewed several villagers for the piece, and their quotes painted a picture of a small dog who had become much more than just a local curiosity. Father Brennan was quoted as saying, "This puppy reminds us daily that love transcends tragedy. His faithfulness is a lesson for all of us about the power of hope." Frau Richter had told the reporter, "In a time when we've all lost so much, Fritz shows us what it means to never give up on the people we love. He's become a symbol of everything good that the war can't destroy." The response to the article was overwhelming. Letters began arriving at the Dresden newspaper office from readers across Germany who had been moved by Fritz's story. Some included small donations of money with requests that it be used to help care for the loyal puppy. Others contained offers to adopt Fritz, though these were politely declined by the villagers who had appointed themselves his guardians. More significantly, the article reached the attention of officials in the German military, who were responsible for coordinating information about missing persons and displaced families. A clerk named Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had been processing thousands of casualty reports and displacement records, remembered seeing the Müller name in connection with the Bernsdorf bombing. Wilhelm spent his lunch break digging through the files, looking for any information about what had happened to the Müller family. What he discovered would have shocked Fritz if he could have understood it. Johann Müller had not been killed in the bombing. He had been away from the farm that night, staying in Dresden on business. When he returned to find his home destroyed, he had been told by survivors that his dog Greta and her puppies had all perished in the barn collapse. Devastated by grief and believing his entire canine family to be dead, Johann had left Bernsdorf to stay with relatives in Munich while he tried to decide what to do with his life. The farm had been his family's for 3 generations, but without Greta and her offspring to help him work the land, and without the house that had been his home since childhood, Johann felt no reason to return. Wilhelm Hoffmann faced a dilemma. Military regulations didn't typically cover reuniting pets with their owners, especially when the owners hadn't requested assistance. But Wilhelm was also a dog owner, and Fritz's story had touched him deeply. After consulting with his supervisor, he decided to send a letter to Johann Müller in Munich, informing him that at least one of his dogs had survived. The letter took 2 weeks to reach Johann, and when it did, he initially dismissed it as some kind of cruel mistake. The pain of losing Greta and the puppies had been so intense that he had forced himself to stop thinking about his life in Bernsdorf. The idea that one of the puppies, little Fritz, according to the letter, had survived and was waiting for him seemed impossible. But Wilhelm Hoffmann had included a copy of the newspaper article with his letter, and Johann found himself reading Fritz's story over and over. The physical description matched his memory of the smallest puppy in the litter, the one who had always been the most attached to human company and the most reluctant to stray far from the house. Meanwhile, in Bernsdorf, Fritz continued his vigil, unaware that hundreds of miles away the person he was waiting for was struggling with emotions he thought he had buried. The weather had turned colder, and snow had begun to fall regularly. Fritz's supporters in the village had constructed a small shelter near his watching post, essentially a wooden box with one open side that he could retreat into during the worst weather, while still maintaining his view of the road. Klaus Weber had convinced his parents to let him visit Fritz every day after school, and he had taken on the responsibility of ensuring the puppy had fresh water and adequate food. Klaus had even begun bringing homework to do while sitting with Fritz, finding that the quiet companionship helped him concentrate on his studies. "My teacher says you're famous now," Klaus told Fritz one snowy afternoon as he worked on his mathematics. "She says people in other towns are talking about you. But I told her you're not doing this to be famous. You're just waiting for your family because that's what loyal dogs do." Fritz had grown accustomed to Klaus's chatter and seemed to find comfort in the boy's presence. On the coldest days, Klaus would bring an old blanket from home and share it with Fritz. Both of them huddled in the makeshift shelter while Klaus read aloud from his school books or told stories about his day. As December approached and the first serious snowfall of winter began, Fritz had no way of knowing that his story had set in motion a series of events that would soon test everything he believed about loyalty, hope, and the power of waiting for love to return. In Munich, Johann Müller had finally made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He had written a letter to the postmaster in Bernsdorf, asking for more information about the puppy who might be his Fritz. If there was even a chance that one of his beloved dogs had survived, he owed it to that animal, and to himself, to find out the truth. The letter was already on its way, carrying with it the possibility of the reunion that Fritz had been waiting for through 2 months of patient vigil among the ruins of his former life. December brought the harshest weather Bernsdorf had seen in years, and Fritz's daily routine became a battle against the elements as much as a test of faith. Snow piled deep around the ruins of the Müller farm, and the small shelter that the villagers had built for him became his primary refuge during the worst storms. But even during blizzards that kept most humans indoors, Fritz would venture out periodically to check the road, his dark form barely visible against the white landscape. The letter from Johann Müller reached Herr Zimmermann, the village postman, on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing for the 5th consecutive day. Herr Zimmermann had become deeply invested in Fritz's story over the months, and his hands trembled slightly as he read the letter, not from the cold, but from excitement about what this might mean for the loyal puppy he had come to admire. Johann's letter was carefully written but filled with barely contained emotion. He explained that he had been told all his dogs had died in the bombing and had left Bernsdorf in grief. He described Fritz in detail, his markings, his size at the time of the bombing, his tendency to stay close to the house. He asked if someone could confirm whether this was indeed his puppy and, if so, whether arrangements could be made for him to return to claim him. Herr Zimmermann immediately sought out Frau Richter, knowing that she had become the unofficial coordinator of Fritz's care. When he showed her the letter, she felt tears forming in her eyes, the first time she had cried tears of joy since the bombing had devastated their community. "We must be careful," she cautioned. Though her voice carried excitement she couldn't entirely suppress. "We cannot get Fritz's hopes up, or our own, until we are certain this is truly his owner. But if it is—" She paused, imagining the reunion that might finally end Fritz's long wait. They decided to respond immediately, but cautiously. Frau Richter would write to Johann describing Fritz's current condition and behavior, and include several questions that only the puppy's true owner would be able to answer. She would ask about Greta, about the other puppies in the litter, about specific details of the farm and Fritz's early life that an imposter would not know. Meanwhile, Fritz continued his vigil, unaware that the answer to his patient waiting might finally be approaching. The snow had made foraging more difficult, but his network of supporters had expanded beyond the village. Care packages had begun arriving from readers of the newspaper article, blankets, food, even small toys that Fritz showed little interest in but that Klaus Weber appreciated on his behalf. Photographer from a larger newspaper in Berlin had traveled to Bernsdorf, specifically to capture Fritz's story in pictures. The photographs that resulted would later become famous throughout Germany. Fritz sitting alert in the snow beside his shelter, his breath visible in the cold air as he maintained his watch. Fritz accepting food from Klaus Weber while never taking his eyes off the road. Fritz curled in his shelter during a snowstorm, but positioned so he could still see through the opening. Klaus had taken on increasing responsibility for Fritz's care as winter deepened. His parents had initially worried about their son's attachment to the dog, fearing that Fritz might not survive the winter, or that his family might never return. But they had come to understand that caring for Fritz was teaching Klaus valuable lessons about responsibility, compassion, and the importance of keeping faith even when situations seemed hopeless. "Fritz is my best friend now," Klaus told his mother one evening after returning from his daily visit. "He never complains about being cold or hungry or lonely. He just keeps doing what he thinks is right. I want to be like that when I grow up." Father Brennan had begun including Fritz in his Sunday sermons, using the puppy's example to illustrate points about faith and perseverance. "Some of you may wonder," he told his congregation one particularly cold Sunday, "whether that little dog's faith will be rewarded. But I would suggest to you that his faith is already its own reward. Every day that Fritz chooses to hope instead of despair, he wins a victory that no bomb can destroy." The priest's words proved prophetic when Frau Richter's letter reached Johann Müller in Munich just before Christmas. Johann's response was immediate and overwhelming. Not only could he answer every question about Fritz and his family, but he included details that convinced everyone in Bernsdorf that this was indeed Fritz's owner. Johann described how Fritz had been the smallest of the litter but the most curious, often wandering away from his siblings to investigate interesting sounds or smells around the farm. He mentioned how Fritz had a small scar on his left ear from a childhood encounter with a particularly aggressive rooster. Most convincingly, he described Fritz's habit of sitting perfectly still when he was concentrating on something important, a behavior that everyone in Bernsdorf had observed during his months of waiting. Johann's letter also revealed the depth of his guilt and grief over leaving Fritz behind. "I should have searched more carefully," he wrote. "I should have known that if any of Greta's puppies could survive such a disaster, it would be Fritz. He was always the most determined of the litter, the one who never gave up on anything he set his mind to." The letter concluded with a request that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who read it. "I would like to return to Bernsdorf immediately to be reunited with Fritz. If you believe he would remember and accept me after all this time apart. I have been lost without my dogs, and I suspect that Fritz has been lost without his family. Perhaps we can find our way back to each other." When Frau Richter read Johann's response aloud to the small group that had gathered in her kitchen, Klaus Weber and his parents, Father Brennan, Herr Zimmermann, and two other village women who had become regular contributors to Fritz's care, the room fell silent as everyone contemplated the magnitude of what was about to happen. Fritz had become more than just a dog to them. He had become a symbol of everything they were fighting to preserve in a world torn apart by war. His reunion with Johann would represent hope fulfilled, faith rewarded, and love triumphant over destruction. But it would also mean saying goodbye to the small, determined presence that had inspired and comforted them through the darkest months of their lives. Klaus was the first to speak. "When will he come?" the boy asked, his voice carrying both excitement and a sadness he was too young to fully understand. "As soon as possible," Frau Richter replied. "He says he can be here by the day after Christmas if we confirm that Fritz is indeed his dog." Outside, snow continued to fall on the ruins where Fritz maintained his faithful watch, unaware that the greatest Christmas gift in the history of Bernsdorf was already on its way to him. The next morning, Frau Richter would send a telegram to Munich with just 4 words: "Come home. Fritz waits." And for the first time since the bombing had destroyed his world, Fritz's long vigil was about to end. The train journey from Munich to Dresden seemed endless to Johann Müller, though it took only 8 hours. Every mile brought him closer to a reunion he had never dared to imagine possible, and with each passing station, his emotions swung between overwhelming joy and paralyzing anxiety. What if Fritz didn't remember him? What if 3 months of abandonment had damaged the bond they had shared? What if the loyal, loving puppy he remembered had been changed by hardship into something suspicious and fearful? Johann carried with him a small leather satchel containing items he hoped might help Fritz remember their life together. A worn rope toy that had been Fritz's favorite as a very young puppy, a piece of cloth that still carried the scent of Greta, and a small whistle that Johann had used to call the dogs in from the fields. He also carried a heavier burden of guilt that had grown with each mile traveled. The train pulled into Dresden on December 26th, the day after Christmas, as gray dawn was breaking over the war-torn city. Johann had arranged to meet Herr Zimmermann at the station, and he spotted the postman immediately. A thin man in his 50s wearing a heavy coat and carrying a sign with Johann's name written in careful script. Herr Müller? Zimmermann extended a gloved hand in greeting. I cannot tell you how happy we are that you have come. Fritz has been waiting so faithfully, and all of us in Bernsdorf have grown to love him deeply. During the bicycle ride from Dresden to Bernsdorf, Johann had borrowed a second bicycle from Zimmermann's brother, the postman, shared details about Fritz's months of waiting that both warmed and broke Johann's heart. He learned about Klaus Weber's daily visits, about the shelter the village had built, about the newspaper articles that had made Fritz famous throughout the region. He has never given up, Zimmermann explained as they pedaled through the countryside. Not for a single day. Rain, snow, freezing cold, Fritz has maintained his watch. The entire village has come to see him as something special, almost sacred. Your dog has taught us all about the meaning of loyalty. As they approached Bernsdorf, Johann felt his heart begin to race. The village showed clear signs of the bombing. Several houses remained in ruins and others bore visible repair work. But there were also signs of renewal. New construction, gardens being prepared for spring planting, children playing in the streets despite the cold weather. The ruins are just ahead, Zimmermann said softly as they turned onto the road that led to what had been the Müller farm. Fritz should be visible from here if he is at his usual post. Johann stood up on his bicycle pedals, straining to see ahead. At first he saw only the devastation that had once been his home, piles of debris, the skeleton of the barn, the blackened foundation where his family's house had stood for generations. But then his eyes found a small dark shape sitting motionless near what had been the front steps. Even at a distance, even after 3 months of growth and change, Johann recognized his dog immediately. Fritz, he whispered, and then louder. Fritz! The sound of his name, called in a voice he had never forgotten, caused Fritz to leap to his feet faster than he had moved in weeks. His head swiveled toward the approaching bicycles, his ears pitched forward, every muscle in his young body suddenly alert and trembling. Johann abandoned his bicycle while it was still moving, stumbling as he tried to run through the snow toward the ruins. Fritz took several tentative steps forward, then stopped as if unable to believe what his senses were telling him. Fritz, boy, it's me, Johann called, his voice breaking with emotion. I'm so sorry, boy. I'm so sorry I left you. Recognition flooded through Fritz like electricity. The voice, the scent carried on the winter wind. The familiar way this human moved. Everything confirmed what his heart had known all along. Patience and faith had been rewarded. Fritz broke into a run, his paws sliding and scrambling on the icy ground as he raced toward the human he had waited for. Through 93 days of unwavering vigil, Johann dropped to his knees in the snow, his arms spread wide, tears freezing on his cheeks as his beloved dog crashed into him with the force of 3 months' worth of suppressed joy. The reunion was everything Johann had hoped for, and more. Fritz seemed to be trying to touch every part of his owner at once, licking his face, pressing against his chest, spinning in circles of pure excitement while never straying more than a few inches away. Johann wrapped his arms around the dog he had given up for dead, feeling Fritz's ribs beneath his winter coat and making mental notes about the care he would need, but most of all simply marveling at the miracle of holding his loyal companion again. You waited for me, Johann whispered into Fritz's fur. You knew I would come back. By this time, word of Johann's arrival had spread through the village, and people had begun to gather at a respectful distance to witness the reunion they had all hoped to see. Klaus Weber stood with his parents, tears streaming down his young face as he watched his daily companion rediscover the joy that had been missing from his life for so long. Father Brennan approached slowly, his elderly face creased with a smile of profound satisfaction. Herr Müller, he said formally, welcome home. Your dog has been a blessing to our entire community. Johann looked up from Fritz, who was now pressed firmly against his side as if determined never to be separated again. I cannot thank you enough, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. You have all cared for him as if he were your own. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Frau Richter stepped forward, her practical nature taking charge even in this emotional moment. Fritz has given us as much as we have given him, she said firmly. He has reminded us daily that love endures, that hope has meaning, and that loyalty is still possible in this broken world. We should be thanking him. Klaus Weber finally found the courage to approach, though he stayed close to his mother's side. Johann noticed the boy immediately and saw something in his face that told him this child had been special to Fritz. You must be Klaus, Johann said gently. Fritz seems to know you very well. At the sound of Klaus's name, Fritz turned his head toward the boy, his tail wagging but his body still pressed against Johann's side. It was clear that Fritz remembered and loved this young human, but equally clear that he had no intention of leaving his owner's side again. I visited him every day, Klaus said quietly. I told him stories and brought him food and sat with him when it was cold. I told him you would come back someday. Johann felt a fresh wave of emotion wash over him. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for believing when I had given up hope. As the crowd of well-wishers gradually dispersed, leaving Johann and Fritz some privacy for their reunion, the full magnitude of what had happened began to settle over both man and dog. Fritz had maintained his faith through 3 months of waiting, and that faith had literally brought his family back from the dead. Johann had learned that love could survive even the assumption of loss, and that sometimes the very act of giving up hope could be overcome by the persistence of those who refuse to stop loving. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ruins that had been Fritz's world for so long. Johann stood slowly, his legs stiff from kneeling in the snow, and looked around at the destruction that had once been his home. Well, Fritz, he said softly, we have some decisions to make. The farm was gone, the house was gone, and the life they had known before the bombing could never be exactly recreated. But as Johann looked down at Fritz, who gazed back at him with absolute trust and contentment, he realized that the most important elements of their life together had survived intact. Fritz had proven that loyalty could transcend disaster, that hope could outlast despair, and that the bonds between those who truly love each other could survive even the worst that war could inflict. Now it was Johann's turn to prove that such faith deserved to be rewarded with a future as strong as the love that had preserved their connection. As darkness fell over Bernsdorf, Johann and Fritz walked together through the village, stopping to thank each person who had played a role in making this reunion possible. Fritz stayed close to Johann's side, occasionally looking back toward the ruins where he had kept his vigil, as if acknowledging the place that had tested and proven his devotion. That night, for the first time in 3 months, Fritz slept curled against a human he loved, warm and safe and certain that his long wait had finally ended. And for the first time since the bombing had shattered his world, Johann slept peacefully, knowing that miracles could still happen and that love, once given truly, never really dies. The story of Fritz's vigil would be told and retold throughout Germany for years to come, but the most important part of that story was just beginning. The part where faith rewarded becomes the foundation for building a new life together. The weeks following their reunion brought new challenges that neither Johann nor Fritz had anticipated. While their emotional bond had been instantly restored, the practical realities of rebuilding a life together in war-torn Germany proved more complex than either could have imagined. Johann had spent his savings during his months in Munich, and returning to Bernsdorf meant facing the daunting task of clearing the debris from his property, securing materials for rebuilding, and finding a way to support himself and Fritz while doing so. The winter of 1943-44 was particularly harsh, and construction materials were scarce due to wartime restrictions. For Fritz, the adjustment was equally challenging in different ways. After months of independence and self-reliance, he now had to remember how to be a companion animal rather than a survivor. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive during his vigil didn't disappear overnight. He startled at unexpected sounds, hoarded food even when plenty was available, and showed reluctance to stray far from Johann's side. Even for short periods, they found temporary lodging with Herr and Frau Weber, Klaus's parents, who insisted that housing Johann and Fritz was the least they could do. After all the joy Fritz had brought their son, Klaus was thrilled to have Fritz living under his roof, even temporarily, and took on the responsibility of helping the dog readjust to domestic life. He's different now, Klaus observed to his mother one evening after spending the afternoon playing with Fritz in their small backyard. He's happy, but he's also more serious than before. It's like he knows things now that he didn't know before. Klaus was remarkably perceptive for a child his age. Fritz had indeed been changed by his months of solitary waiting. He was more observant, more cautious, and somehow more mature than other dogs his age. But he was also more appreciative of simple pleasures. A warm meal, a comfortable place to sleep, the sound of Johann's voice calling his name. Johann noticed these changes too, and made a conscious effort to help Fritz feel secure in their renewed relationship. He established routines that Fritz could depend on: morning walks, regular meal times, evening sessions where Johann would sit quietly while Fritz settled beside him. These predictable patterns seemed to help Fritz understand that their separation was truly over. The village of Bernsdorf had been profoundly affected by Fritz's story and the successful reunion. In a time when most news was grim, Fritz's vindicated faith had provided a source of hope that extended far beyond their small community. Letters continued to arrive from across Germany, many containing small donations to help with Johann and Fritz's rebuilding efforts. More importantly, Fritz's story had inspired other acts of faith and persistence. A woman in Hamburg wrote that Fritz's example had encouraged her to keep searching for her missing son, who had been separated from the family during a bombing raid. A farmer in Bavaria wrote that he had decided not to abandon his damaged land after reading about Fritz's refusal to give up on his home father. Brennan recognized the broader significance of what had happened and began documenting the story more systematically. He interviewed Johann extensively about their life before the bombing, recorded detailed accounts from villagers about Fritz's behavior during his vigil, and collected copies of all the newspaper articles and letters that had been generated by the story. "This is more than just a heartwarming tale about a boy and his dog," Father Brennan explained to Johann during one of their conversations. "Fritz represents something that we cannot allow the war to destroy: the belief that faithfulness has meaning, that waiting for what we love is worthwhile, and that hope can be stronger than despair." As spring approached and the snow began to melt around the ruins of the Müller farm, Johann made a decision that would define the next phase of their life together. Rather than trying to rebuild exactly what had been lost, he would create something new that honored both the past and the lessons learned during their separation. With the help of volunteers from the village and materials purchased with donations from Fritz's admirers, Johann began constructing a smaller, more modest house on the same foundation where his family home had stood. But this new house would be different. It would include a special room dedicated to telling Fritz's story and welcoming visitors who wanted to meet the famous dog who had become a symbol of loyalty throughout Germany. Fritz seemed to understand and approve of this plan. As construction began, he resumed something resembling his old vigil, but now he was watching over the building process rather than waiting for someone to return. He would position himself where he could observe the workers, occasionally approaching to investigate their progress, but always returning to his chosen observation point. Klaus Weber spent most of his free time at the construction site, serving as Fritz's companion and unofficial supervisor of the building process. The boy had grown visibly during the winter months, and his relationship with Fritz had evolved from that of caretaker to genuine best friend. "Fritz taught me something important," Klaus told his father one evening as they walked home from the construction site. "He taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just not give up. Even when everything looks hopeless, if you keep believing, sometimes miracles happen." The construction progressed steadily through the spring and early summer of 1944. The new house was simpler than the original, but more thoughtfully designed. Large windows provided clear views of the road where Fritz had maintained his vigil, and the special room that Johann had planned included display cases for the newspaper articles, letters, and photographs that documented Fritz's story. But the most important feature of the new house was less visible. It was built with the understanding that its primary purpose was to be a home where a man and his dog could live together, appreciating each day as a gift that might easily have been lost forever. As the house neared completion, Johann realized that Fritz's story was entering a new chapter. The vigil was over. The reunion had been achieved, and now they faced the more complex task of living up to the example that Fritz's faithfulness had set. The dog who had once waited alone among ruins had become a symbol of hope for thousands of people across Germany. Now he needed to learn how to be both a beloved pet and an inspiration to others, a responsibility that would test his character in entirely new ways. On a warm July evening, as Johann sat on the steps of their nearly completed new home with Fritz resting contentedly beside him, He reflected on how much both of their lives had changed since that terrible night in September, when the bombs had fallen. "We've both learned something about faith, haven't we, boy?" Johann said softly, scratching behind Fritz's ears. "You taught me that love doesn't end just because everything else falls apart. And I hope I've taught you that sometimes the people we're waiting for really do come home." Fritz looked up at Johann with eyes that held both wisdom and contentment, then settled his head back on his paws and resumed his quiet observation of their rebuilt world. The waiting was over, but the living had just begun. 5 years had passed since Fritz's vigil ended, and the German shepherd who had once been a small puppy waiting among ruins had grown into a magnificent dog whose story continued to inspire people across a continent slowly healing from war. The year 1949 brought peace to Germany, and with it, visitors from around the world who made pilgrimages to Bernsdorf to meet the famous dog whose loyalty had become legendary. Johann and Fritz's new life had found a rhythm that balanced the quiet domesticity they both craved with the public role that Fritz's fame had created for them. The special room in their house had become a small museum of sorts, displaying hundreds of letters from people whose lives had been touched by Fritz's story, photographs documenting his vigil and reunion, and newspaper articles in multiple languages that had spread his tale across Europe and beyond. Fritz, now fully grown and bearing the dignified bearing of a mature German shepherd, handled his celebrity status with remarkable grace. He seemed to understand that certain visitors came not just to see Johann's rebuilt farm, but to witness proof that faith and loyalty could survive the worst circumstances. For these pilgrims, Fritz would sit patiently while they told him their own stories of loss and hope, his intelligent brown eyes conveying a depth of understanding that amazed everyone who met him. Klaus Weber, now 13 years old and Fritz's oldest friend outside of Johann, had become something of a tour guide for the steady stream of visitors. He could recite Fritz's story from memory, but more importantly, he could explain what the story meant to the people of Bernsdorf and to anyone struggling to maintain hope in difficult times. Fritz didn't wait because he was stubborn. Klaus would tell visitors as they stood near the spot where the original farmhouse had been. He waited because he understood something that humans sometimes forget, that love is stronger than circumstances. Even when everything around him was destroyed, the love between him and Johann remained intact. Father Brennan, now in his 70s, but still serving the community with unwavering dedication, had completed his comprehensive documentation of Fritz's story. His book, titled Faith on Four Legs, The True Story of Fritz of Bernsdorf, had been published in German and translated into several other languages. The modest profits from the book were used to establish a fund that helped reunite other separated families in the aftermath of the war. Fritz's story proves that individual acts of faithfulness can have consequences far beyond what we might imagine, Father Brennan wrote in the book's conclusion. One small dog's refusal to abandon hope has brought comfort to thousands and served as a reminder that the human spirit, and the spirit of those creatures who share our lives, is capable of extraordinary endurance. Johann had found his own peace in this new life. The rebuilt farm was smaller than the original but more prosperous, partly due to the visitors who came to hear Fritz's story and often purchased produce or handmade items as mementos of their visit. More importantly, Johann had discovered a sense of purpose he had never expected, serving as keeper of a story that seemed to grow more meaningful as time passed. "I used to think that Fritz's waiting was about him missing me," Johann confided to Father Brennan during one of their regular conversations. "But I've come to understand that his vigil was about something much larger. He was demonstrating a truth that the world desperately needed to see, that loyalty has power, that hope has substance, and that love transcends even the most devastating circumstances." Fritz had also become a father, though this development had required careful consideration from Johann. A female German shepherd named Liesel, owned by a family in the neighboring village, had captured Fritz's attention during one of their walks. After much discussion between the two families, it was decided that Fritz should have the opportunity to pass on not just his genes, but perhaps some measure of his remarkable character. The litter of 5 puppies born in the spring of 1949 became instant celebrities in their own right. Visitors to Bernsdorf delighted in seeing Fritz's offspring, and Johann found himself carefully screening potential owners to ensure that Fritz's children would go to families who understood the responsibility of caring for dogs with such famous lineage. One of the puppies, a female who bore a striking resemblance to Fritz's mother, Greta, was kept on the farm. Johann named her Hope, and she became Fritz's constant companion and the continuation of his legacy. Fritz seemed to take great pleasure in teaching Hope the routines of farm life and the proper way to greet visitors who came to hear their story. As 1949 drew to a close, Johann realized that Fritz was entering the mature phase of his life. At 6 years old, the dog was still healthy and active, but Johann had begun to think about the inevitable passage of time and what Fritz's story would mean for future generations. A proposal came from the German government to create a permanent memorial at the site of Fritz's vigil, a small monument that would tell his story for visitors long after Fritz himself was gone. Johann initially resisted the idea, feeling that Fritz was still very much alive and that memorials were premature. But as he observed Fritz training Hope and interacting with the steady stream of visitors, he began to understand that the story had grown beyond any individual dog or man. Fritz's vigil among the charred ruins had become a parable about the power of faithfulness in dark times. His story was being told in schools, referenced in sermons, and cited by politicians and philosophers as an example of the qualities that could help humanity recover from the devastation of war. On New Year's Eve 1949, as Johann sat by the fire, in their rebuilt home with Fritz resting at his feet and Hope curled up nearby, he reflected on the remarkable journey they had shared. A bombing raid that was meant to destroy had ultimately created one of the most powerful stories of hope and loyalty in modern history. Fritz lifted his head and looked at Johann with the same intelligent, devoted expression that had characterized their relationship since he was a puppy. In those brown eyes, Johann could still see traces of the small dog who had refused to abandon his post among the ruins, but he could also see the wisdom that came from having lived a life that mattered. "You did something extraordinary, boy," Johann said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Fritz's ears. "You proved that one individual, no matter how small, can make a difference if they refuse to give up on what they believe in." Outside, snow was beginning to fall on Bernsdorf, just as it had during those long months when Fritz kept his solitary vigil. But now the snow fell on a thriving community, a rebuilt farm, and a story that would be told for generations as proof that loyalty, hope, and love could survive anything the world might throw at them. Fritz's vigil among the charred ruins had ended years ago, but his legacy, the demonstration that faithfulness has power and that waiting for love is never in vain, would continue for as long as humans needed reminding that miracles are possible for those who refuse to stop believing in them.